Unit 3 The Theories of Environment-Behavior Relationship. 3.0 Introduction. We often refer to environmental psychology as a multidisciplinary paradigm that finds its mention in other fields of study. The 1960s saw an emergence of this discipline as the degrading environment vexed scholars. The environment was a major factor in the development and ongoing conduct of people. Scholars took to developing scientific methods to examine the relationship between the physical environment and human behavior. It also developed various models and theories. This unit will discuss the nature and functions of environmental behavior relationship. It will also explain the theories and models of environmental behavior. 3.1 Nature and functions of environment-behavior relationship. It really should come as no surprise that the term environment lacks specificity. Among others, historians, biologists, architects, sociologists, economists, and psychologists have used the term idiosyncratic in defining variables of interest in their disciplines. Historians have sought the environmental zeitgeist, biologists the ecological niche, architects the design features, and economists the ratio of supply to demand to account for external influences on human behavior. Whereas the term environment lacks specificity, it is possible to be explicit regarding the assumptions that underlie its study. The assumptions that we see as underlying all environmental science, independently of specific orientation, are: 1. The Earth is the only suitable habitat we have. 2. The Earth's resources are limited. 3. The Earth as a planet has been and continues to be profoundly affected by life. 4. The effects of land use by humans are cumulative. 5. Sustained life on Earth is a characteristic of ecosystems and not of individual organisms or populations. Implicit in these assumptions is a call not only for multidisciplinary but also for interdisciplinary strategies, methods, and philosophical perspectives in perceiving, understanding, and maintaining the delicate relationships that exists between humans and their environments. 1. The Earth is the only suitable habitat we have, and its resources are limited. Throughout the history of the Earth, various forms of life have begun, evolved, prospered, and died out, with the present dominance of humans being a very recent development. But, despite this current domination, we must face two fundamental truths: a. Humans, 2. will succumb to extinction either through geologic, meteorological, or interstellar cataclysm, natural biological processes, internecine quarrels, or because the Earth's resources will no longer support human life in its present form. b. Although there may be other habitable islands in the cosmic sea, they are spaced at such great distances throughout the universe as to be virtually irrelevant to human survival. Notwithstanding these certainties, the Earth is very important to those of us who are now living and to the coming generations. We must learn to live with the opportunities and the limitations the Earth affords, with the inexorable fact that it is dynamic. And we must do so in a way that allows for continued human existence. The newly emerging area of environmental psychology holds the promise of providing information that will allow sustained human tenure on Earth. 2. The Earth as life has profoundly affected the planet. Human contributions to the visual landscape of the planet are everywhere: tall skyscrapers, intricate networks of highways and electrical lines / engineered lakes / and the vapor trails of high-flying jet planes are constant reminders of human presence. More subtle indicators are the changing quality of the chemical composition of the atmosphere, geologic changes in the Earth's crust, engineering changes in hydrologic processes, and chemical changes in the waters that cover the planet. Clearing of forests, plowing of land, blacktopping of highways and parking lots not only affect the Earth visually but change the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the light reflecting and absorbing characteristics of the Earth's surface and hydrologic drainage patterns. These changes influence the rate of heating and cooling and, therefore, the temperature of the Earth and its atmosphere. Humans thus influenced weather and climate. A more thorough understanding of how humans influence the Earth's natural processes will lead to more intelligent and life-preserving behaviors on one's part. In environmental psychology, the term environment is referred to as a tangible and imagined interpretation of the world, which includes both architectural and social surroundings. It also includes natural environments, social settings, and constructed environments, as well as considers the learning and informational environment. It is an interdisciplinary field that throws light on human beings and their surroundings. It also deals with one's ability to adapt both physically and mentally to the various changes that continue to take place in our environment. Further, environmental psychology is a multidisciplinary paradigm that draws a lot from the knowledge of people from other disciplines. It relies on the findings of geographers, economists, geologists, policymakers, psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists, educators, etc. Environmental psychology is also popular as human factor science or cognitive ergonomics, or environmental social sciences. It explores dissimilar issues which are of great significance. Some issues are listed here: common property resource management, the effect of environmental stress on human performance, the characteristics of restorative environments, human information processing, the promotion of durable conservation behavior. Environmental psychology believes that we should interpret the environment as a major factor in the development and ongoing conduct of people. One environmental psychology gives more attention to the environment, which has focused only on micro-level stimuli and events like people's homes, neighborhoods, and work and community settings. 2. Kurt Lewin's action research orientation sets scientific goals for analyzing and explaining people and environmental transactions with the more practical goal of enhancing. It optimizes and enhances people's relationships with their environment through effective planning. 3. Environmental psychology is a multidisciplinary approach to the study of environment and behavior, since it focuses on analyzing and enhancing the quality of people's relationships with their physical environments. It also incorporates the perspectives of architecture, urban planning, psychology, anthropology, sociology, geography, and other fields. The fundamental significance of environmental psychology for the design professions lies in its potential capacity to provide a body of knowledge, conceptual and empirical, for understanding the relationships between human behavior and experience in the built environment. Thus, we may define environmental psychology as the scientific study of the transactions and interrelationships between people and their physical surroundings, including built and natural environments, the use and abuse of nature and natural resources, and sustainability-related behavior. 3.2 Theories in environmental psychology. On the one hand, the interdisciplinary nature of environmental psychology is laudable in that they brought various perspectives to bear on a single phenomenon, leading, it is hoped, to fewer tunnel vision theories and applicable solutions. It is this very multiplicity that leads to difficulties in the systematic application of knowledge and the development of well-articulated unifying theories. 3.2.1 Historical influences. Theories have influenced thinking among environmental psychologists both within and outside of the discipline of psychology. Some of these theories are very broad in scope, whereas others are more focused. Some are lacking in empirical basis and others are more data-based. We will review several of them to provide the context for a consideration of current theories of environment-behavior relationships. These perspectives include geographical determinism, ecological biology, behaviorism and Gestalt psychology. Some historians and some geographers have attempted to account for the rise and fall of entire civilizations based on environmental characteristics. For example, Toynbee theorized that the environment, specifically topography, climate, vegetation, availability of water, etc., presents challenges to its inhabitants. Extreme environmental challenge leads to the destruction of a civilization, whereas too minor challenge leads to stagnation of culture. Thus, Toynbee proposed that an intermediate level of environmental challenge enhances the development of civilizations, and extremely diminished or excessive levels are debilitating. The notion of environmental challenge and behavioral response, although rooted in the thinking of such geographical determinists, appears often in one form or another in various theories in environmental psychology. As one example, Barry, Child, and Bacon have suggested that agricultural, non-nomadic cultures seem to emphasize responsibility, obedience, and compliance in child-rearing practices, whereas nomadic cultures often emphasize independence and resourcefulness. These differences, they suggest, result from the fact that people who live and work together in organized non-mobile communities require a more structured organization and therefore stress the importance of obedience and compliance. Nomads inculcate independence and resourcefulness in preparation for meeting the changing and unpredictable demands of an environment confronted by roaming people. Thus, the argument goes, the environment sets the stage for the development of cultures having the best chance of surviving it. This does not differ from saying that ghetto culture cultivates a set of skills in its inhabitants that are best suited to the ghetto. Someone not skilled in the craft of street fighting, perhaps, is not likely to survive the environment of the streets. We will see later in this unit that some have carried this argument to the point, and other institutional environments develop in their inhabitants that are ostensibly survival certified to these environments, yet to be maladaptive in the larger environment. The development of ecological theories concerned with biological and sociological interdependence between organisms and their environment, have also significantly influenced thinking in environmental psychology. With the development of ecological science, organisms were no longer viewed to be separate from their environment but were integral to it. This notion of organism-environment reciprocity now appears in many current environment behavior theories. The environment and its inhabitants are still often studied as separate components, but no one doubts their interdependency. These various components constitute a total system and interactions between the components are assumed to bring the change. 3.2.2 Arousal theories. Arousal theories have typically been concerned with the influence of arousal on performance. They maximize performance at intermediate levels of arousal but falls off as arousal is increased or decreased. This relationship, sometimes referred to as an inverted U relationship, has been shown to differ slightly depending on whether performance is measured on simple or complex tasks and is often referred to as the Yerkes-Dodson law. These relationships are consistent with other findings that humans seek intermediate levels of stimulation, and are reminiscent of Toynbee's assertion, referred to earlier, that cultures only develop in environments that provide intermediate environmental challenges. It has also shown performance changes that are very curvilinear with temperature increases. One explanation of these findings is that increase in ambient temperature leads to increase in arousal levels. Initially, the higher arousal leads to performance enhancement, but as it increases further, over-arousal occurs, causing performance decrements. Similarly, it has been shown that personal space invasions lead to increases in arousal and performance decrements. Increases in noise level have been associated with changes in arousal and performance. Thus, several variables associated with arousal changes are related to performance changes, and performance has consistently been curvilinear related to arousal. Other theorists using an arousal perspective have featured physiological responses to environmental stimulation. Changes in heart rate, blood pressure, respiration rate, galvanic skin response, and adrenaline secretion, among others, have been shown to occur with changes in the environment. Increased ambient temperature leads to blood vessel dilation, perspiration, increased heart rate, and, in extreme conditions, lowered blood pressure and insufficient oxygen supply to the brain. It has linked personal space invasion to delayed onset and shorter duration of maturation for males. And noise exposure alters blood pressure, heart rhythm, and the flow of gastric juices to the stomach. Neurologists, such as HEP, have linked arousal with increased activity of the reticular activating system of the brain. Still, other theorists have equated arousal with changes in motor activity or with self-report of arousal. Berline has, for example, characterized arousal as lying on a continuum anchored at one end by sleep and the other by excitement, and Mirabian and Russell have identified arousal as a major component in people's affective responses to their environment. Independent of the orientation taken concerning arousal, several consistencies are apparent. 1. The associated changes in arousal with changes in the environment. 2. Pleasant as well as unpleasant stimulation increases arousal, that is, room temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit and obnoxious noises influence arousal in ways similar to a roller coaster rides and such other stimulating situations. 3. Changes in arousal lead people to seek information about their internal states as well as to seek information from others. 4. People evaluate moderate levels of arousal positively. 5. Often, great expenditures of energy are used by individuals to bring the environment to a level of moderate stimulation. Performance is predicted to be optimal for both simple and complex tasks at intermediate levels of arousal. Arousal above the level leads to decrements in performance. Factors affecting arousal level. Furthering the point, various researchers have tried to identify the impact of different environmental factors on the arousal level. Temperature. An increase in ambient temperatures leads to increases in arousal levels. Usually, higher arousal leads to performance enhancement, but as it increases, further over-arousal occurs, causing performance decrements. Increased ambient temperature leads to the following physiological changes: blood vessel dilation, pupil dilation, perspiration, increased heart rate. Extreme conditions also lead to lowered blood pressure and insufficient oxygen reaching to the brain. 2. Personal space invasion. An increase in personal space invasion leads to an increase in arousal and performance decrements. 3. Noise level. An increase in noise level leads to an increase in arousal and performance decrements. It alters blood pressure, heart rhythm, and the flow of gastric juices to the stomach. Arousal and nervous system. It linked arousal to increased activity of the reticular activating system of the brain and the associated changes in arousal with changes in the environment. Pleasant as well as unpleasant stimulation increases arousal, i.e. room temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Changes in arousal lead people to seek information about their internal states. People associate moderate levels of arousal positively. Individuals use great expenditure of energy to bring the environment to a moderate level of stimulation. 3.2.3 Stimulus load theories. Central to stimulus load theories is the notion that humans have a limited capacity to process information. When inputs exceed that capacity, people ignore some inputs and devote more attention to others. These theories account for responses to environmental stimulation in terms of the organism's momentary capacity to attend to and deal with salient features of its milieu. The stimuli most important to the task are in the focus of attention, whereas the others are in the margin. For example, while driving during heavy traffic, we invest attention in the vehicles and road signs around us, and we pay less attention to the commentator on the car radio, people in the back seat, or the clouds in the sky. If the less important stimuli interfere with the task at hand, then ignoring them will enhance performance. For instance, ignoring the children's fighting will make you a better and safer rush hour driver. If, however, the less important stimuli are important to the task at hand, then performance will not be optimal. For instance, ignoring the road signs because you are attending to the more important trucks, cars, etc., may lead you 30 miles out of your way in getting home. Sometimes the organism's capacity to deal with the environment is overtaxed or even depleted. When this occurs, we attend only the most important information, with all other information filtered out. Once attentional capacities have been depleted, even small demands for attention can be draining. Thus, behavioral after effects, including errors in judgment, decreased tolerance for frustration, ignoring others in need of help, can be accounted for by these theories. For example, the exhausted rush hour driver eventually might reach the point where he or she doesn't notice the traffic light turn from red to green, or worse yet, from green to yellow to red, even though this is a very important stimulus. Decreased tolerance for frustration may lead to laying on the horn or lane hopping, and motorists in the breakdown lane may be ignored, if not looked upon with disdain. Stimulus load theories can also account for behavioral effects in stimulus-deprived environments. For example, certain behaviors occurring aboard submarines and in prisons. This approach suggests that understimulation can be just as aversive as overstimulation. So-called cabin fever resulting from monotonous living conditions can also be seen as the result of understimulation. Walwil has argued that environments should be depicted in terms of measurements applied to the dimensions of intensity, novelty, complexity, temporal variation, surprisingness, and incongruity, all of which contribute to stimulus load. Subsequent behaviors can then be related to the stimulus properties of environments in systematic and comparable ways. 3.2.4 Behavior constraint theories. Behavior constraint theories focus on the real, or perceived, limitations imposed on the organism by the environment. According to these theories, the environment can prevent, interfere with, or limit the behaviors of its inhabitants. The development of the behavioral constraint model comes from Brehm's reactance theory, which states that there is a basic desire among human beings to maintain their behavioral freedom. An environment is constraining when something is limiting or prevents an individual from achieving his intentions. Certain environmental conditions like noise, crowding, temperature, location, or specific features such as bad weather, barriers, objective experiences such as control may be perceived as constraining by the individual. In such a situation, the person feels as being out of his/her control. This feeling of not being able to control the situation produces psychological reactance. Wertmann and Brehm suggest that if failures or loss of control persist for a longer period of time without any chances of restoration, the individual will cease to make any instrumental efforts and thus enter into a helplessness state. Allen and Greenberger worked extensively in this area and suggested that before entering into a state of helplessness, an individual will try to alter his/her physical environment, if the previous effects of modifying the social environment did not prove successful. For instance, while trying to teach in a noisy classroom environment, the teacher first tries to request the children to remain quiet before asking the naughty ones to move out of the class. This modification, if expressed in the form of personalization or any other social change, will be in a socially approved and benign manner, else could also resort to drastic causes like intentional damage to the environment. Breaking of school furniture, switchboards, vandalizing or looting of public property during riots are certain examples of these negative form of perceived control. It has also been suggested that boundary mechanisms are crucial to an individual, and one sets up certain regulatory systems to regain certain amount of control. So for instance, when someone invades our personal space during the course of a conversation, we try to regain it by moving a step further away or displaying some other behavior like crossing our arms and the like. We may sometimes invent systems to prevent or reduce the chances of invasion. Sitting on one edge of an empty park bench or trying to get the aisle seat while traveling are examples to prevent encroachment. Very few of us will sit in the center, or even if we do, we spread out personal belongings on either side of us. An important aspect of everyday life of an individual is having a sense of controlling the environment, which induces a sense of well-being. When people perceive control in a noisy situation, like by putting on earplugs, they are less aggressive, and they are more often helpful. On the contrary, the perception of loss of control leads to manifestation of negative consequences on behavior, well-being and health. Averill has discussed three categories of control: A. The behavioral control, which provides the subject with the opportunity to change the disturbing environmental events. B. Through cognitive control, the individual adopts reappraisal technique to perceive the environment as less threatening. And C. The decision control provides the subject with an opportunity to choose the best possible alternative. The behavioral constraint model is very effective in explaining human behavior in terms of control component. However, this approach alone cannot explain the environment-behavior relationship in an effective manner. 3.2.5 Adaptation level theories. Adaptation level theories assume that each of us has a minimum threshold for a certain level of environmental stimulus. A slight rise or fall in this threshold is a focus of arousal, overload, underload or stress. Variations in behavior will therefore occur if the stimulus load is outside our experienced adaptation levels. Major proponents of this position include Helson and Wall-Will. While all environmental psychologists emphasize the interrelationship of humans to their environment, adaptation level theorists speak specifically of two processes that make up this relationship: the processes of adaptation and change. Organisms either adapt, i.e., change their response to the environment, or they adjust, i.e., change the environment with which they are interacting. Adaptation to decreases in ambient temperature includes piloerection, hair on the body standing up, or what is commonly called getting goose pimples, muscle rigidity, increased motor activity, vasoconstriction. Adjustments include throwing another log on the fire or turning up the thermostat. Either process brings the organism back to equilibrium with its environment. Wall-Will distinguished three categories of stimulation: sensory, social and movement, along the three dimensions of intensity, diversity and patterning. Amongst these, optimal or intermediate level of arousal or stimulation is desirable for positive responses and task performance. For instance, if aloofness and gregariousness are the two poles of a social interaction scale, then either of them can be desired by a subject at some span of time depending on the level of exposure he/she is facing. The urge to spend some time alone, or nowadays known as my time, either in a quiet resort or in an aloof place by the working young generation of today, is probably getting its ideas from this theory only. Another value of this approach is that it recognizes individual differences in adaptation level, i.e., the level of stimulation/arousal that the individual has become accustomed to and expects or desires in an environment. Thus, This approach can explain the different responses of two individuals to the same environment. For example, we may perceive a boisterous party as pleasant to a person high in need for sensation, but as overwhelming for the person who prefers a low level of sensation. By the same token, some people revel in the crowded atmosphere of last-minute festival shopping, while others abhor the inconvenience of having two or more shoppers in the same store with them. These individual differences in adaptation level lead to quite different behaviors. The person high in need for sensation will seek boisterous parties, whereas the person preferring low levels of sensation would avoid them or seek havens of solitude within them. We can ascribe some differences in their behaviors to differences in their adaptation level. In yet another study, it was observed that when concentrating on important tasks, the subjects were perturbed both by the presence of a persisting noise as well as by the complete lack of it. Thus, an optimal level of stimulation is desirable for an appreciable task performance. For instance, some students like to hear some soothing music or mantras while studying or concentrating on important tasks. However, there may be some variations in the optimal level in different individuals depending on their experience and proximity with a given environment. For example, the heat and temperature of a bangle factory can be too overpowering for a person on entering for the first time, while the workers of the place are quite immune to it. Similarly, people of hilly areas when settled in lowlands have a high resistance to cold temperature as compared to the native residents of that place. This variation in optimal level is termed as adaptation. According to Will, adaptation is a quantitative shift in the distribution of judgmental or affective responses along a stimulus continuum as a function of continued exposure to a stimulus. Dubose defines adaptation as the process which allows people to adjust to their environment, variations in the perception of the environment and coping mechanisms undertaken to overcome the problems it creates. Adaptation involves physiological as well as psychological processes. The phenomenon of light and dark adaptation accomplished by the human eye is a classic example of physiological adaptation to intense stimuli of light. An individual previously residing in an area close to railway station may perceive his forward/her new house in the center of the city as much quieter, is an example for setting a psychological benchmark of adaptation for evaluating new conditions. The process of defensive reappraisal or defensive re-evaluation can be very useful in dealing with stress emancipating from the extreme environmental stimuli. In this reappraisal, the environmental conditions which were once perceived as overwhelming or threatening, over a period of time may be re-evaluated as bearable or less threatening. Defensive reappraisals are self-generated. They arise from needs within the person rather than from environmental pressures. In a study conducted on a flock of sheep, it was observed that when the paddock of the sheep was near the highway, initially the sheep used to run hither-thither on the arrival of any motor vehicle. However, with the passage of time the approaching vehicles were perceived as less threatening and they used to continue with their grazing. Appraisal-focused strategies occur when persons modify the way they think, for example, employing denial or distancing oneself from the problem. People may also alter the way they think about a problem by altering their goals, values such as by seeing humor in a situation. So, defensive reappraisal consists of any effort made to interpret the past more effectively or to deal with present harms and threats by viewing them in a less damaging and threatening way. Sometimes subjects are seen to resort to behavioral adaptations. This kind of adaptation can be defined as the response a person gives to environmental stimulus and a change in that corresponding behavior. In India, for instance, adjusting to the rituals and customs by the bride being different from her family, after her marriage. Similarly, when an individual emigrates to a new country, he/she has to cut down on his traditions to follow the traditions of the new country. The theory of adaptation presents an active and dynamic relation of the individual with his/her environment. However, the postulates of this theory cannot be generalized as it does not explain variation in adaptation levels across individuals, so precise prediction of behavior with respect to environment becomes difficult. 3.2.6 Environmental stress theory. The environmental stress theory studies the effect of environmental factors on the biological adaptation of an individual. Stress may be defined as a change in the reaction of mind and body to any event that brings about a change. This change could be pleasant, unpleasant or boring. Stress exists when the demands posed by the environment exceeds the coping capacity of an individual. Coping is an attempt to regain control over the stressing or constraining situation. According to the psychological stress model, environmental conditions such as noise, temperature, crowding, daily hassles may provoke physiological, emotional and behavioral reactions which may induce a lot of negative outcomes. The situation or stimulus in the environment is the stressor and the corresponding behavior to it is the stress response. 4 general types of environmental stressors have been identified: cataclysmic events, stressful life events, daily hassles and ambient stressors. Cataclysmic events are sudden catastrophes that require major adaptive responses from the victims. Floods, earthquakes, eruptions, war and imprisonments are some examples of cataclysmic stressors. Stressful life events are major incidents in the lives of people that require personal or social adaptive responses. These include change in family status, marriage/divorce, economic conditions or job changes and like. Daily hassles are the typical life events like interpersonal problems, environmental events, noise, crowding, and the like, which may cause frustration, tension or irritation. Ambient stressors are more continuous, relatively stable and intractable conditions of the physical environment that largely go unnoticed unless they interfere directly with some important goal or threaten health. Stress theories emphasize the mediating role of physiology, emotion, and cognition in the organism-environment interaction. Environmental features are impinging, through the senses, on the organism, causing a stress response to occur when environmental features exceed some optimal level. The organism then responds in such a way as to ease the stress. Part of the stress response is automatic. Initially, there is an alarm reaction to the stressor, wherein various physiological processes are altered. Resistance then follows as the organism actively attempts to cope with the stressor. Finally, as coping resources are depleted, a state of exhaustion sets in. Increasingly, though, psychologists have concerned themselves with additional aspects of the stress response. Lazarus, for example, has focused on the appraisal process. According to him, people must cognitively appraise the environment as threatening before stress occurs and behaviors are affected. Our harried rush hour driver of a few pages back would not, by this criterion, be stressed unless this individual appraised the traffic as threatening. Confronted with a potentially stressful situation, the individual appraises the situation. Appraisals involve both assessing the situation, primary appraisal, as well as secondary appraisal, i.e., evaluating the possibilities of coping with it. The term coping refers to adaptive or constructive strategies that help reduce the stress level. Adaptation and coping models are very helpful in studying the human behavior under stressful conditions. If the individual is able to cope with stress in a positive manner, then it enhances the performance of an individual. Baum and Paulus studied that even in stressful conditions of noise and crowding, positive coping strategies elevated the arousal level of the subjects, thereby increasing their task performance. However, if the individual is not able to deal with the stress in a constructive manner, negative consequences such as performance deficits, psychosomatic complaints and psychological or physical breakdown can be seen. On the whole, the environmental stress model helps understand the impact of stress on human performance and behavior. It also explains the combined and individual impact of environmental stresses on human behavior in a comprehensive manner. 3.2.7 Ecological theories. Central to the thinking of ecological theorists is the notion of organism-environment fit. Environments are designed or grow to accommodate certain behaviors. Behavior settings, as Barker termed them, are evaluated in terms of the goodness of fit between the interdependent environmental features and the behaviors that take place. Ecological theories explain that there is a symbiotic relationship between a person and their environment, i.e., they are dependent on each other. Human behavior and responses are directly related to the environmental settings, and slight alterations or modifications can lead to a change in the characteristics of the former. Ecological perception is described as the process by which people relate to and respond to their environment. It describes organisms and their environment as mutually reciprocal. This concept suggests that the environment merely represents itself and that one's own perception permits further investigation of the environment. Essentially, the approach places the initial human responses to external factors in the category of instinctual responses. It stresses that every child is born with a set of instinctual responses that help it to survive. Theories about people living together in a spatial environment, territoriality, personal space, crowding, are examples of the ecological approach. According to the ecological perspective, behavior is the function of its physical and social setting. Barker and Wright exemplified their work on ecological theories to understand human behavior and focused on behavioral setting. A behavioral setting is a self-referenced, internally interdependent and self-defined entity that consists of one or more standing patterns of behavior such as classroom, library, temple, recreational areas, etc. Barker documented a day in the life of several young children, observing how even without prompting, their modes of expression and outward behavior seemed to change dramatically when their events were varied. It was observed that the children unconsciously manifested different coping strategies and behavior depending on the type of events they were encountering. For instance, we speak in a soft voice in a library in an automatic manner while our tones are on a higher note when we go for a movie or to a city mall. This has something to do with the quietude architecture of the library and the chaotic arrangement of a multiplex or mall. This theory of ecological perception from James J. Gibson and Ilana Gibson states that although two individuals can be simultaneously in a particular environment, their perceptions can be widely different because each experiences a different reaction. Barker argued that there are certain mechanisms that guide adaptive behavior in settings and help people to predict behavior in a setting. He named these mechanisms as circuits and divided them into four types: A. Program circuits, syllabus, play program, schedule. B. Goal circuits. People in a setting have certain goals, so they behave in a particular way to achieve that goal. C. Deviation countering circuits. These are the behaviors people do or follow to achieve the setting goals. D. Vetoing circuits. Occur when people are excluded from the behavior setting. Barker's theory of behavioral setting is molar and contextual in nature. It tries to emphasize on the similarity of behaviors between people in the same setting, and describe the rules that seem to exist. A derivative of the behavioral setting theory is the Manning theory, which has been used to explain human crowding. According to the theory, an individual's behavior is determined by the supply and demand of the social roles existing in a setting. An individual will experience more crowding when a setting is overmanned, i.e., when the number of occupants of the setting exceeds that required for the normal functioning of the setting than when it is undermanned. BAPCH synthesizes the salient aspects of the effects of undermanned settings. In general terms, undermanned behavior settings in comparison with optimally manned behavior settings impose more and stronger forces on their inhabitants in more varied functions. The forces are, however, more prevailingly directed inwards and towards other inhabitants. Undermanned behavioral settings have stronger internal interdependence and cohesiveness. They are stronger things vis-a-vis their inhabitants than optimally manned behavior settings. Manning theory, now known as staffing theory, focuses on the idea that when there are fewer people available for a number of behavior settings, the pressure on an individual to assume responsibilities heightens. Synomorphy, which is the degree of fit between a behavior setting and the individual within it, is an important concept in staffing theory. When a place is high in synomorphy, the number of people and the types of tasks being performed match what the behavior setting provides, and the individuals can achieve maximum productivity. The ecological perspective has its share of advantages and disadvantages. The theory has high external validity as it has been tested in real-life behavioral settings. However, the number of extraneous variables being very high, it may be difficult to establish a precise causal relationship between various predictions and outcomes. The ecological theory has proved to be very useful in understanding human behavior and can be applied in assessing the layout and designing of residential areas to avoid congestion and ensure safety. 3.3 Critical comparison of theories of the environment-behavior relationship. Each of the theoretical stance has its costs and benefits. The arousal, stimulus load, and adaptation level approaches all share the advantage of the ability to incorporate a wide variety of physical and social environmental characteristics under the rubric of overall stimulation level. Thus, diverse factors such as noise, temperature extremes, room color, verbal information rate, and crowding can all be conceptualized as contributing to environmental stimulation levels. Further, all three approaches are useful in predicting potential adverse responses when environmental stimulation deviates from some optimal level. The arousal approach is the most general in identifying physiological and affective mediators of the environment-behavior relationship, that is, increases or decreases in stimulation produce corresponding changes in physiological and psychological arousal. Written produce predictable variations in behaviors such as task performance and aggression. The stimulus load approach is synaptic, focusing on cognitive and information processing abilities, and yields predictions regarding social /behavioral consequences of over/unstimulating. Excessive attentional demands have differential effects on performing primary versus secondary tasks and the likelihood of attending to various social stimuli. The adaptation level approaches to the most specific, predicting that the consequences of a particular stimulation level depend on the specific level to which an individual has become adapted. The generality-specificity dimension is a theoretical trade-off. The more general theories account for aggregate responses of large numbers of people to the same environmental conditions, but in doing so gloss over some potentially important individual differences in people's responses to those conditions. For example, while arousal theory might accurately predict worse performance, on average, in noisy compared to quiet settings, there may be some individuals who, because of their adaptation level, might even perform better in the noisy setting. The more specific theories account for some of these individual differences, but are more limited in scope, thus creating difficulties in making inferences about what are optimal environmental conditions for most people. For example, the adaptation level theory could lead to as many predictions about performance level as there are people at the same level of noise. All three approaches have limitations regarding the reliability and validity of measures of their concepts. Thus, for example, measurements of physiological arousal, for example, heart rate, galvanic skin response, and psychological arousal, for example, self-reported emotional state, that are simultaneously got sometimes yield contradictory results. Also, systematic and valid measures of stimulus load and adaptation level are difficult to obtain. As a result, all three approaches have difficulty predicting what optimal stimulation levels are and exactly when these levels deviate significantly from optimum. This limits the ability to predict behavioral responses to various stimulation levels. The stress approach incorporates elements of all the above. We can characterize stress in terms of physical and social environmental conditions that deviate from some optimal level, for example, a noisy and crowded subway, and are thus potentially disruptive to human functioning. We can also conceptualize stress in terms of physiological responses, for example, arousal and health, affective responses, for example, subjective discomfort, and cognitive responses, for example, appraisal, to environmental conditions. This approach is also useful for accounting for the effects of a wide variety of environmental conditions on several important mediators of environment-behavior relationships under the general construct of stress. The approach has a further advantage of predicting behavioral coping and the consequences. Of course, this approach suffers from the same programs of measurement as those discussed above. For example, it is difficult to determine objectively which conditions are stressful, for example, heavy metal vs. jazz music, as well as individual differences in response to them, for example, adolescents versus their parents. However, the stress approach has been widely used in environmental psychology. The behavioral constraint approach is the most limited of all in scope, i.e., it is primarily useful in situations where the perception of loss of control or threats to control is present. However, when such conditions exist, the concepts of reactance and learned helplessness yield useful predictions of behavioral responses to such conditions. The ecological approach has the broadest scope with the concept of behavior setting and is a useful descriptive approach to understanding the behaviors of large numbers of people in different settings. However, this generality limits the approach's ability to account for individual differences in the behavior setting. Another disadvantage is that its reliance on the field observation method does not permit causal inferences regarding the determinants of behavior. 3.4 Research in Environmental Psychology. Evans in his article has recapitulated the current research trends in environmental psychology. He feels that environmental psychology has lost much of its viability as an independent field within psychology over the past decade. Much of the early enthusiasm in North America has been waned and very little collaborative ideas are forthcoming between behavioral scientists, architects and designers. However, the satisfactory aspect is that research generated in environmental psychology has been fully adopted into mainstream psychology. The popularity of environmental psychology can be inferred from various vantage points. For instance, the subscription rates of three major journals in the field, Environment and Behavior, Journal of Environmental Psychology, and the Journal of Architectural Planning and Research are at all times high. The courses on environmental psychology in North America are attracting students in large numbers. A number of textbooks on environmental psychology have published new editions. 2 new texts have been published in the US in 1990s. Furthermore, Bourne's and Secchiaroli text is published in Italy. In India, Tripathi has published a textbook on environmental psychology in the native Indian language. In India, the undergraduate and postgraduate courses on environmental psychology are offered and are well received by students in major universities and colleges. Books are published in major areas of environmental psychology, and articles on environmental psychology are incorporated in many visible volumes on various branches of psychology. However, in the Indian context, adding the prefix environment is sometimes noticed together with a trend of compiling articles presented in seminars and proceedings in edited volumes on various general themes of environmental psychology. Nevertheless, all these endeavors considered together are index of the popularity and growing visibility of environmental psychology. The Cambridge and Gowers Ethnoscape series on environment and behavior have received overwhelming support from readers, and each series are having several volumes in the pipeline. The Handbook on Environmental Psychology sold out of press and is now being reissued by Krieger Publications. Evans in his article reported that the handbooks of both social and health psychology, and New Handbook of Psychophysiology contains chapters on environmental topics. Cognitive mapping has emerged as an important area in cognitive sciences. Various journals devoted on cognition are incorporating more and more articles on spatial memory, wayfinding, and computational model of environmental cognition. Furthermore, environmental education is emerging as a major sub-area within educational curriculum. Research studies in the area of child psychology and lifespan development have started focusing on immediate and background setting and its linkages with healthy development. The education of architects includes some exposure to human behavior and behavioral science. The idea that features of the physical design affect users is more or less accepted by design professionals. While architects who are in practice have not accepted much of the knowledge of behavioral science. However, in some specialized fields like interior designs and landscape, architects have shown considerable interest in many aspects of environmental psychology-induced knowledge and have collaborated with behavioral scientists. In many countries, the new field of investigative psychology is contributing to the criminal justice system. This new field covers major areas of environmental psychology including place theory, territorial behavior, environmental cognition, prison studies and so forth. In United States and Europe, considerable efforts are evident in understanding life in space and developing programs for housing travelers and workers in outer space. In the field of human factor engineering, health and safety issues in the workplace is attracting interest, and the inputs from environmental psychology are put into use. Indoor air quality and stress in workplace are topics which are generating renewed interest. Human response to various spaces prior to their actual development is attracting researchers. The computer simulation techniques are being used and more practical applications of environmental psychology are analyzed. Research on environmental stresses like crowding, noise, pollutants as well as natural and technological disasters are studied, and its relationship with health and cognition are examined. During emergency situations, the natural behavior of people have provided valuable insights and leads to emergency planning policies so as to reduce harmful effects. Studies on multiple stresses, cross-situational effects from home to workplace and vice versa are also attracting researchers' attention. Another important area is to study global environmental issues. Evans has reported that the human dimensions of global change has emerged as an important priority area in US, and several environmental psychologists like Paul Stern and his associates have published a recent monograph in this area. Besides Annual Review of Psychology, the Journal of Environmental Psychology has recently published a special issue on the topic. A number of researchers are focusing their study on the relationship between global environmental changes and psychology. This area derives insights from operant paradigms and motivational theories centered around explaining how to arrest ecologically destructive behaviors. In the developing countries, people are living in suboptimal conditions. The substantial population is suffering from day-to-day environmental problems including substandard housing and unhygienic living conditions surrounded with dirty and cramped atmosphere. The focus of research is to connect poverty and poor environmental quality within the framework of environmental psychology. A number of studies are conducted on poverty in the Indian context. However, in most of the studies the role of physical environmental features is either ignored or de-emphasized. This gap is realized and some modest attempts are made to study Indian villages taking the physical environmental aspects and examining their relationship with community relationships and health measures. Furthermore, only meager attempts and research work on Indian slums are conducted by psychologists. For instance, a study was planned to examine the impact of rehabilitation of poor slum inhabitants who were previously exposed to unfavorable environmental conditions. The focus of this study was given on environmental quality, crowding and health. One major result of this study indicated that slum inhabitants who were provided ownership of their slum units by the government exhibited a tendency of improving the environmental quality of their individual and shared dwelling and neighborhood environment and reported better health relative to their counterparts who were residing in the unauthorized piece of land or were not eligible for ownership of slum units. It seems that feeling of ownership of slum unit is one important factor in protecting and improving the environmental quality of the neighborhood. Environmental psychologists are encouraged to conduct researches on economic diversity and marginalized communities such as tribal villages, etc. How people have responded to process of acculturation and technological advancements introduced in present era is an important line of research. Similarly, some researches are conducted in congested inner city areas where community groups, crowding, and environmental quality are connected with social support, tolerance and health measures. In addition, more systematic studies which incorporates physical environmental features like type of housing, poor environmental quality, scarcity of resource conditions and poverty dimensions particularly in rural areas, developed underdeveloped villages, tribal non-tribal and different ethnic groups are needed to enhance our understanding of environment-behavior relationships in the Indian context. Culturally specific studies are also needed to tap the traditional understanding on managing the environmental problems. For example, in traditional Indian texts have sizable coverage of the importance of physical environments and required attitudes and behavior on the part of human beings. In the present times, the individual has ignored such a rich tradition in order to emulate the Western concept of modern development. The popular paradigm of development necessitates the exploitation of environmental resources without any limit. Such exploitation of physical resources has already created an imbalance in the availability of environmental resources and their requirement for human population on this earth. The fact that the current environmental problems are the result of pursuing the modern paradigm of development. To create a balance between availability of resources and the requirement, a new paradigm for development may be needed. The lifestyle of the human population is now entirely dependent on technology and sophistication, but pro-environment behavior is nonetheless most important. Obviously, this care needs proper attitudes, proper management of the available resources, proper management of the environmental resources, and eco-friendly behavior even at the cost of little discomfort. Hence, The responsibility of environmental psychologists is to translate the traditional ideas, cultural sentiments into scientific methodologies which are both eco-friendly and can be easily adapted by common people. Current studies have emphasized on the interactions between neuroscience and architecture. Developments in science and technology, including bioinformatics, artificial intelligence, virtual realms, and neuroscience, and in interdisciplinary collaborations between these fields led to the emergence of new perspectives, data collecting devices, and measurement techniques, which eventually expanded the knowledge on human-built environment interaction. The above discussion represents only a sample of current research trends and future direction of research in environmental psychology. It is important to undertake studies across cultures and across different ethnic lines to understand the similarities and differences in responses to various environmental provisions. The moderators and mediator variables may be identified and more precise tests may be undertaken to understand the complexity of environment-behavior relationships. 3.5 Summary. To sum up what we have learned in this unit, here is a quick recap. There are several major theoretical perspectives guide environmental psychologists, covering different aspects of human-environment relationship. Arousal theories assume that each task performance requires an optimal level of environmental stimulation. A variation in this level leads to arousal which has a curvilinear relationship with task performance. The stimulus load theories explain the relation between environmental stimulus and human behavior. It underlines the idea that if an individual's capacity to cope with the environmental stimulus is exceeded, it leads to distraction. The behavior constraint approach explains that if an individual feels that they have no control over the physical environment, a feeling of helplessness creeps in. This leads to a restriction in the normal behavior pattern of the individual. The adaptation level approaches stress that if there is a variation in the individual's threshold to deal with an environmental stimulus, it would lead to stress and poor psychological well-being. The environmental stress approach studies the effect of various environmental conditions and factors on the physiological adaptation levels of an individual. It clearly explains the concept of stresses and their effect on human behavior in terms of well-being. The ecological theories explain that human and environment are dependent on each other and share a symbiotic relationship. That the human behaviors are directly linked to the characteristic of the physical environment is the main concept of this theory. Research in the area of environmental psychology has gained prominence not only in developed countries, but also in developing countries. However, there is a need of more culture-specific studies. Recent developments in the area of artificial intelligence, neuroscience, etc., as well as an interdisciplinary approach has further given new directions in research,